At 9:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, just 2 hours and 13 minutes before the midnight cutoff, Canada is set to halt all energy exports to the United States. This action will trigger an immediate energy crisis in the U.S., causing refinery shutdowns, shortages of gasoline, and widespread electricity blackouts. Despite urgent appeals from 31 governors, congressional leaders, and members of his own cabinet urging compliance with Canada's 5 demands before the deadline, President Trump refused to acquiesce. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took to national television for an emergency address. In this 19-minute broadcast, Carney revealed a historic and unprecedented economic move, announcing that at midnight, alongside the Phase 2 energy embargo, Canada will invoke its powers under the Emergencies Act and Article 21 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, to halt all commercial trade with the United States. This suspension will remain in effect until the U.S. satisfies Canada's conditions. Effectively, this means that at midnight, energy exports from Canada to the U.S. will stop, and all other Canadian exports to the United States will be frozen. Imports from the U.S. into Canada will also cease. Cross-border trucking and rail freight will come to a standstill. Commercial shipping between the two nations will halt as well. Annually, goods and services worth roughly $900 billion will be instantly frozen. The U.S.-Canada border, the longest undefended border globally and among the most economically intertwined, will be shut down for all commercial activity at midnight. Freight currently en route will be turned away at the border. Trucks delivering Canadian automotive parts to U.S. assembly plants will be stopped. Trains carrying American agricultural products into Canadian processing facilities will not cross. The $2.5 billion of daily bilateral trade will plummet to zero overnight. President Trump is reportedly overwhelmed. His advisors are scrambling, and congressional leaders are calling for emergency sessions. Within 2 hours, this entire $900 billion trading relationship, the cornerstone of North American economic integration, will vanish. In this detailed overview, I will explain the ramifications of suspending $900 billion in annual trade, highlighting the impact on specific industries and communities reliant on this cross-border commerce. I will outline the immediate ripple effects starting at 12:01 a.m. when trucks and trains get turned away at the closed border crossings. I'll also discuss the emergency meetings taking place in Washington as officials grasp the severity of the impending economic disaster. Further, I'll illustrate why this total suspension of trade is more catastrophic than any prior Canadian action, and why the U.S. economy is heavily dependent on its commercial ties with Canada. You'll also receive minute-by-minute updates in these final 2 hours before midnight as President Trump faces the stark choice between conceding to Canadian demands or risking total economic collapse. Subscribe to join the community and share this video if you find this information valuable. Let's break down what freezing $900 billion in trade means in tangible terms, as raw numbers alone don't capture the full social and economic consequences. The United States exports about $360 billion worth of goods and services annually to Canada, making Canada the largest export market for American goods. Conversely, the U.S. imports approximately $540 billion in goods and services from Canada yearly, ranking Canada as the second largest source of U.S. imports following China. This massive $900 billion bilateral trade supports around 2.44 million American jobs, both directly in export industries and indirectly through transportation, logistics, and other trade-related services. Starting at midnight, all this activity will freeze. Here's what that looks like by industry. Automotive sector, valued at $90 billion in bilateral trade each year, this industry mainly involves vehicles and parts crossing the border multiple times during manufacturing. Partially assembled components shuttle back and forth between facilities in the U.S. and Canada as part of the production process. The automotive industry's tightly integrated supply chain relies heavily on just-in-time delivery of parts. Once the border shuts down at midnight, U.S. auto assembly plants will exhaust their inventories of Canadian parts within 24 to 48 hours. Factories in states like Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and others are expected to start closing by the weekend. This shutdown will result in roughly 120,000 U.S. auto workers being furloughed within a week as production grinds to a halt. In agriculture and food, the annual bilateral trade amounts to $45 billion, which includes U.S. exports of vegetables, fruits, grains, and meat to Canada, and Canadian exports of grains, vegetables, seafood, and processed foods to the U.S. When the border closes, American farmers lose Canada's market instantly. Canadian food processors that rely on U.S. agricultural inputs will also shut down, creating further losses for U.S. producers. Grocery stores in the U.S., especially in northern states that carry Canadian food products, will face shortages of specific items within a matter of days. Manufacturing inputs account for $120 billion in cross-border trade annually, covering materials like steel, aluminum, plastics, and chemicals used in production. U.S. factories relying on Canadian inputs will encounter shortages within days, leading to production slowdowns or halts. Canadian manufacturers depending on U.S. inputs will face similar challenges. However, Canada has spent the last 2 weeks diversifying its supply chains by investing $30 billion into alternative sourcing projects, a strategy that gives Canada flexibility the U.S. currently lacks. Turning to infrastructure and logistics, the U.S.-Canada border manages roughly 400,000 truck crossings each month, 30,000 rail car crossings, and thousands of air cargo shipments. When trade ceases at midnight, trucking companies will lose critical routes, rail operators will suffer freight shortages, and air cargo carriers will have shipments canceled. About 40,000 American truck drivers specializing in cross-border hauling will find themselves out of work. Rail firms will see immediate revenue losses, and logistics companies will be forced to lay off workers managing cross-border shipments. Retail and consumer goods account for $65 billion in annual bilateral trade, including products sold widely in both countries. U.S. retailers selling Canadian-made goods or those shipping through Canadian distribution channels will face inventory shortages. Canadian retailers will experience similar issues. More importantly, U.S. companies manufacturing for the Canadian market will lose that entire sales channel as $65 billion in annual sales vanish overnight. Energy and related products involve an additional $50 billion in trade annually, beyond the crude oil, natural gas, and electricity covered under the Phase 2 energy embargo. This includes refined petroleum products, petrochemicals, and energy equipment. When trade stops, U.S. refineries lose access to Canadian markets. Canadian petrochemical plants cannot export to the U.S., and key supply chains in the energy sector will be disrupted. Here's the immediate timeline beginning at midnight. 12 a.m., March 12, 13. The trade suspension starts. The Canadian Border Services Agency closes all commercial border crossings to freight, with U.S. Customs and Border Protection doing the same. 12:15 a.m. The first trucks carrying goods arrive at border crossings only to be turned away. Truck drivers are informed that the crossings will stay closed indefinitely. Chaos quickly develops as hundreds of trucks are backed up at major points such as the Ambassador Bridge, Detroit-Windsor, Peace Bridge, Buffalo-Fort Erie, and Pacific Highway Crossing, Washington, British Columbia. Trucking firms begin recalling drivers and canceling shipments. 6 a.m., March 13th. U.S. manufacturing plants start to report missing Canadian shipments overnight. Production plans are disrupted. Factories contact suppliers who confirm the border closure with no timeline on reopening. 9 a.m., March 13th. Major automakers, including Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, announce production halts at U.S. plants due to parts shortages triggered by the border shutdown. Approximately 60,000 assembly plant workers are sent home. By noon on March 13th, reports surfaced of grocery store shortages in northern U.S. states affecting specific Canadian products like maple syrup, certain seafood, and some vegetables. Stores began posting notices to inform customers that these shortages were a direct result of the trade suspension. By 3 p.m. the same day, the first wave of layoffs was announced. Businesses dependent on cross-border trade reported furloughing workers as they were unable to ship or receive goods. Within just 15 hours of the trade halt, approximately 150,000 American workers were impacted. Here's what's unfolding in Washington during these final 2 hours before midnight. At 10:00 p.m., exactly 2 hours before the deadline, the Senate convened an emergency session. Sources say Majority Leader Chuck Schumer opened by stating, in 2 hours, $900 billion in trade stops. In 2 hours, 2.4 million American jobs hang in the balance. In 2 hours, the economic foundation of North America collapses. We are here to urge President Trump to immediately accept Canada's demands to prevent this disaster. Republican Senator Mitt Romney then spoke, reportedly saying, as a lifelong Republican, I have never supported forcing a president's hand this way, yet President Trump's refusal to meet Canada's reasonable terms threatens a national economic collapse. The Senate must act. I am backing emergency legislation to remove this authority from the president and empower the vice president to negotiate and implement a resolution without presidential consent. At 10:15 p.m., 105 minutes before the cutoff, the Senate voted on Romney's emergency measure. The outcome was 78-22 in favor, surpassing the two-thirds majority needed. This law grants the vice president authority to accept all 5 Canadian conditions on behalf of the U.S., with any such actions carrying full legal force regardless of the president's approval. 5 minutes later, at 10:20 p.m., the House held an emergency session where Speaker Kevin McCarthy swiftly brought the same bill to a vote. The House passed it 352-83. With overwhelming bipartisan support in both chambers, the legislation became law. At 10:25 p.m., 95 minutes prior to the deadline, congressional leaders informed the White House that the vice president was authorized to accept Canada's terms and would act without delay. At 10:30 p.m., President Trump posted on Truth Social, Congress has committed treason by stripping my authority. I will veto this unconstitutional law. I will never surrender to Canada. America is stronger and will endure without Canadian trade. 5 minutes later, White House counsel advised Trump that the legislation passed with veto-proof majorities and that any veto would be overridden immediately. The law was already in effect, leaving Trump powerless to stop the vice president. At 10:40 p.m., Vice President J.D. Vance contacted Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly. According to insider reports, Vance declared, on behalf of the United States and pursuant to congressional authority, I accept all 5 Canadian requirements. 1. Immediate removal of all tariffs on Canadian goods by the U.S. 2. A renewed commitment to NORAD and unrestricted intelligence sharing. 3. Recognition that Canadian provinces are sovereign territories, affirming that contrary statements don't reflect U.S. policy. 4. Payment of $14.7 billion in compensation within 7 days. 5. Full acknowledgement of Canadian sovereignty over its natural resources. In return, we request that Canada suspend the Phase 2 energy cutoff and trade suspension while implementation is verified. At 10:45 p.m., Minister Joly consulted with Prime Minister Carney. 5 minutes later, at 10:50 p.m. and 70 minutes before the deadline, Carney held a brief press conference stating that the vice president, acting under congressional authority, had accepted Canada's conditions without reservation. Canada acknowledged this authority and thus suspended the energy embargo and trade halt, pending verification over the next 48 hours. Energy and trade would continue unimpeded, and border crossings would remain open. The crisis was declared over for now. At 10:55 p.m., President Trump posted on Truth Social, the vice president betrayed me, Congress betrayed me, everyone betrayed me. I am the president and did not authorize this surrender. At 11:00 p.m., the White House chief of staff issued a statement declaring the situation a coup. The statement explained that the vice president acted under authority legally granted by Congress through legislation passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. It confirmed the Canada crisis was resolved. Energy supplies would continue flowing, trade would proceed uninterrupted, and the vice president's actions are legally binding despite the president's social media claims. At 11:15 p.m., Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Dick Durbin announced that hearings would begin Monday to determine if President Trump's conduct during the Canada crisis warrants impeachment proceedings. By 11:30 p.m., financial markets reacted strongly during after-hours trading. Dow futures surged 2,800 points as investors welcomed the end of the crisis. Treasury yields declined as fears of economic collapse eased, and the U.S. dollar strengthened on renewed confidence in American stability. Here are 3 key takeaways from tonight's developments. 1. President Trump was completely sidelined. Congress vested authority in the vice president to act despite Trump's objections. Although Trump remains president in title, he has no control over the crisis that came to define his tenure. 2. Canada achieved total victory. The United States accepted all Canadian demands after a sustained 6-week campaign led by Prime Minister Carney, culminating in a complete U.S. capitulation. 3. U.S. constitutional norms have been deeply altered. Congress removed power from a sitting president and gave it to the vice president. This unprecedented move sets a significant precedent for the balance of power between branches, potentially impacting future administrations. In the hours ahead, close attention will be paid to any legal challenges President Trump mounts against Congress's actions, speculation within the cabinet about invoking the 25th Amendment, and whether Canada formally confirms verification of the agreement's implementation. At 10:50 p.m., just 70 minutes before the scheduled freeze of $900 billion in trade, Canada accepted Vice President Vance's unconditional agreement. Energy flows and cross-border trade continue without interruption. President Trump has been defeated, marginalized, and reduced to expressing frustration via social media, while Congress acted decisively to resolve the crisis.